As a performing musician, I'm constantly learning new music. I estimate I learn something like 200 pieces of music in an average year, often on short notice. And between the hectic pace and the sheer volume, I might even say that the ability to learn music quickly is the single skill I've found most valuable as a performer. So, what's the trick? Well, ultimately it boils down to how and what you practice. It's easy to fall into the trap of treating piano as a single skill and assuming that if you're practicing at all, you'll get better at all aspects of it. But in reality, there are lots of separate skills that go into being a good pianist, and people tend to get better at whichever subset of skills they prioritize, sometimes at the expense of the others. Music schools often place a heavy emphasis on spending months just polishing a few pieces, with the result being that many conservatory students can play a handful of pieces really well, but aren't very quick at learning music because it's just not something they've spent as much time practicing. So, my first piece of advice to anyone who wants to get faster at learning music is just to learn more music. It doesn't all have to be super difficult. In fact, it can actually be really beneficial to spend some time learning music that's significantly easier than the hardest thing you can play. With each piece you learn, you have the chance to examine every aspect of your learning process and make note of what's working and what isn't. In my experience, analyzing and refining your learning process is easiest when you're working on music that isn't that hard, because it's easier to observe the progress from one practice session to the next. My second piece of advice is to learn music carefully. When I was younger, I didn't always follow this advice. I thought I could save time by not bothering to come up with good fingerings and by approximating tricky rhythms. But I actually found that I got a lot faster at learning music once I started being more careful. A big part of this is due to the fact that with each new piece you learn, you're building your musical vocabulary. And if you take the time to work out fingerings and sort out the technique, the first time you encounter a passage, you'll have a big head start every time you encounter similar or identical passages in the future. Ever since I realized this, I've been trying to learn every piece I play as thoroughly as my schedule allows, and these days it's pretty rare for me to encounter a new piece that doesn't already feel somewhat familiar. My third piece of advice is to analyze all the music you play. There are lots of ways to do this, but knowing some music theory usually helps. When I'm learning a new piece, I'm always eager to get past the sight reading stage as quickly as possible, which means that I have to find ways to translate the information on the page into a format that my brain can actually use. One way to do this is by figuring out the harmonies and memorizing the chord progressions. Another is to look for patterns and formulas such as scales and arpeggios. But even if neither of those methods work, it's always possible to analyze the way the notes are laid out on the keyboard. For example, sometimes a passage will be written using only white keys or only black keys. Once I've noticed that, it makes it a lot easier to remember the notes. It can also be helpful to notice which notes can be grouped together into hand positions. Once all the notes have been analyzed and sorted into groups, I don't have to read them all individually anymore. My fourth recommendation is to use a variety of practice methods. There are a lot of different ways to practice the piano, and some are definitely better than others, but I've yet to discover any one method that is always best. Rather, I found that different methods are best for accomplishing different things. In my view, practicing is basically problem solving, so I always approach it by trying to figure out what's preventing me from playing the piece how I want to, and then coming up with a strategy to address that. Most of the time, it's one of two things. Either I don't know the piece well enough, or the technique I'm using isn't adequate. If I'm first starting out with a piece, it's usually a combination of both, but as I work on it longer, the balance might start to shift one way or the other. And as this happens, practice methods that were effective early on in the learning process might become less effective, and vice versa. This brings me to my final recommendation, which is to consider both the micro and the macro. In other words, consider the scope of what you're practicing. Sometimes I practice by playing through an entire piece or recital program several times in a row. And other times, I'll practice just a few notes, or even a single note, until I get it just how I want. But usually, my practicing falls somewhere between the micro and macro scale. There are advantages to practicing both large and small sections, so with nearly every piece I learn, I spend at least some time focusing on everything from the smallest details all the way up to the big picture, and I'm constantly shifting my focus between these levels. A mistake I see a lot of pianists make is to get too caught up on one level of focus. For example, always practicing a page or two at a time, but never running through the whole piece or spending time refining the details. If you've never done it before, it might seem tedious to work through a whole piece just a few notes at a time, but once you get used to it, it can be a really effective way to practice. For one thing, when you're working at such a small scale, you can make big changes to how you're playing in a matter of seconds rather than minutes or hours. It also takes less attention to read a few notes than it does to read an entire passage, which frees up some concentration to focus on things like technique earlier in the learning process. In fact, a lot of what I know about piano technique is stuff I learned by taking just a few notes at a time and trying to figure out the best way to play them. When I first discovered how effective practicing really small chunks could be, I spent several years learning all of my music this way. I don't do it as much anymore, but I'm fairly confident I wouldn't be able to learn music as quickly as I do now without the experience I gained during those years. These days, I usually go in cycles between focusing on the big picture and the details. When I'm first learning a new piece, I usually start by sight reading through the whole piece. During this phase, I'm just trying to get a feel for the piece and develop a strategy for learning it. Then I go back and start working through the piece section by section. Once I've got a decent sense for the piece as a whole, I start spending more time refining the details. After doing some detail work, I go back to focusing on the big picture again, and the cycle repeats. I try to avoid staying at any one level of focus for too long. When I was learning all my music from the details up, I'd often lose sight of the big picture, which meant sometimes I'd spend a lot of time refining a passage, only to realize later that the way I was playing it didn't really make sense in context. But by shifting my focus more frequently, I find that I'm better able to keep the big picture in mind when I'm working on details, and vice versa. Eventually, I usually reach the point where I feel pretty aware of the details even when I'm playing through large sections, at which point just playing through the whole piece a few times can be a pretty quick way to tie everything together. Anyway, that's it for this video. Learning music is a pretty individualized process, so some of the methods I'm describing here might not work for everyone. But if you're interested in learning music more quickly, I hope this video has given you some things to think about. If you found this video interesting, I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Thanks for watching.